My wife's sister slapped me before my son could finish, setting a 27-year-old Father's Day card beside my plate.
The crack of her palm stopped every conversation in the room. The yellow loan letter inside my jacket pressed against my ribs. "You are not even a real father," Vanessa shouted. "You only adopted them." My cheek burned. Across the table, Ava went still. Ben pushed back his chair. Two blue handprints covered the card, one from each child, with the word Dad written in crooked yellow crayon. It was my 68th birthday. Ava had found the card while helping Ellen sort the Cedar cabinet and brought it as part of the gift she and Ben planned to frame for me. I touched my cheek, then looked at the woman who had just used my children's adoption as a weapon. "Since you brought it up," I said, "perhaps you can tell Ava and Ben why copies of their adoption papers are attached to a $640,000 loan in your company's name." Vanessa's face changed before she could stop it. My wife, Ellen, lowered the birthday cake she had been carrying. "What loan?" she asked. Vanessa recovered quickly. "He is lying because he wants everyone against me." I removed a yellow envelope from my jacket and placed it beside the handprint card. It had arrived that morning from a commercial lender I had never used. The envelope was addressed to Ava and Ben at our house. The old family address printed on their adoption records, even though neither had lived there in years. The letter asked the two alleged guarantors to confirm a loan for Cedar Row renovations. A company controlled by Vanessa, the packet listed Ellen's Orchard as collateral. I had spent the hours before the gathering hoping there was an innocent explanation. Then Vanessa arrived with a prepared statement for me to sign. It said Ava and Ben had always allowed their mother's blood relatives to handle family property. I refused. That was when she slapped me. Ben moved around the table. "You used our names." "Sit down," Vanessa snapped. "Your father does not understand how family assets work." "He is my father," Ben said. His voice was calm, which frightened me more than shouting would have. I stood between them. "Nobody touches anybody else," I said. "Nobody signs anything. Ellen, put the cake down. Ava, bring the envelope. Ben, stay with your mother." Vanessa laughed once. "There he goes. Giving orders like signing an adoption decree made him blood." "No," I said. "It made me responsible. I did not accuse her of forgery in that room." I did not know yet whether she had submitted the packet, whether someone had used her company's name, or whether the lender's letter was itself false. I knew only that the signatures beside Ava's and Ben's names did not look right, and Ellen said she had never offered the orchard for a loan. That was enough to protect first. I asked everyone except Ellen and the twins to leave. Vanessa refused until Ben opened the front door and stood beside it. As she passed me, she pointed at the yellow envelope. "You have no authority over where those papers came from. Then the people named on them can answer for themselves." She walked out without apologizing for the slap. I locked the door, photographed the unopened packet exactly as it had arrived, and called the lender using the number from its public website rather than the number printed in the letter. The fraud officer confirmed the letter was real. She could speak fully only after Ava, Ben, and Ellen verified themselves, but the old address explained why the notice had reached our mailbox. She would not discuss the full account until identities were verified. She could place an immediate hold on the undispersed portion because both alleged guarantors and the property owner disputed their signatures. "Has any money left?" Ellen asked beside me. The officer paused. Cedar Row received an $80,000 preliminary draw against its business application. The other $560,000 depends on confirming the guarantors and orchard collateral. The danger was no longer only paper. She froze the remaining balance and asked us not to confront Vanessa again while she scheduled protected interviews for each person named in the file. Then I made my evidence decision. I hired a licensed investigator who handled commercial identity cases. He could preserve a real business interaction and voluntary conduct in a public commercial area under our fictional state's rules. He could not enter private spaces, invent a conversation, or use Ava and Ben as bait. The lender already has its own records, he said. My job is not to create a crime. It is to keep anyone from rewriting what they voluntarily do next. That was exactly what I wanted. I was 68 years old. I had spent most of my life building cabinets and repairing old houses. A good door taught the same lesson as a good family. Strength came from what held when pressure reached the joints. Vanessa had struck my face. The pressure I cared about was aimed at the people behind me. Ellen sat at the kitchen table after the call. The candles on her cake had never been lit. One side of the frosting had slid against the box. She is my only sister, she said. I know. She has always believed Dad favored me. Ellen's parents had left the orchard to her because she stayed and worked it after their health declined. Vanessa received money and a smaller rental property. She sold the property within 3 years, then spent the next decade describing the orchard as the share Ellen had stolen. Resentment could explain a cruel sentence. It could not sign a loan. Ava slid the old Father's Day card into a clean plastic sleeve. Tea from the gathering had reached one blue handprint. I brought this because Mom said you still kept everything we made, she told me. I do. Did Aunt Vanessa always think we were less family? Ellen looked down. I answered before shame could answer for her. Whatever she thinks belongs to her. It does not define you. Ava and Ben had always known they were adopted. Ellen and I adopted them when they were 5, after a distant cousin could no longer care for them. We never turned the fact into a secret or a debt. Their birth history belonged to them. Their place at our table belonged to all 4 of us. Vanessa had attended the adoption hearing. She had cried when the judge asked whether our extended family supported the placement. That memory hurt more than the slap. The twins had arrived at our house with one red suitcase between them. Ben carried a wooden train with one wheel missing. Ava kept a folded list of foods she believed good children were supposed to like. For the first month, both asked permission before opening the refrigerator. Vanessa was the aunt who brought them winter coats. She sat on the floor and helped Ben rebuild the train wheel from a bottle cap. When Ava woke from nightmares, Vanessa sometimes stayed until morning. That history did not excuse what she was doing now. It kept me from making her into a stranger who had wandered into our family fully formed as a villain. Some betrayals hurt because love was never there. This one hurt because once it had been. The investigator arrived the next morning. I gave him copies provided through the lender's protected process, not the originals from our home. He repeated the boundary in front of Ellen, Ava, and Ben. A real commercial meeting and public exterior conduct, with no private space entry or invented transaction. Ben crossed his arms. So we wait for her to lie again. We let the lender ask the questions it already has a right to ask. I said, and if she walks away? Then we protect your credit and the orchard with what we have. I could hear his disappointment. He wanted a door he could kick open. I wanted a door that would still close when this was over. Our first verification happened at home. Ellen kept family records in a cedar box inside a locked cabinet. The box held amended birth records, adoption decrees, identity papers, and letters the twins could choose to read when they were older. A separate folder held recent orchard access forms Ava and Ben had signed when Ellen updated emergency and maintenance permissions. The cabinet showed no damage, but the cedar box was out of order. Ellen arranged every folder by year. The adoption folder sat behind tax papers from 5 years later. 2 certified identity pages were missing. So were copies of the orchard access forms carrying Ava's and Ben's adult signatures. Only 4 people had used the cabinet key during the past year: Ellen, me, Ava, and Vanessa. Vanessa had borrowed it 3 months earlier while helping Ellen search for their mother's handwritten recipe book. That did not prove she took anything. It gave the missing papers a path out of our house. Ava and Ben completed their lender interviews separately. Both denied the signatures. Neither had heard of Cedar Row renovations. Ellen denied the signature on the collateral page. I was not listed as an owner of the orchard because Ellen inherited it before our marriage and kept title in her name. Vanessa had used that fact to tell the family I had no standing. She was partly right about one thing. I could not cancel a loan in someone else's name merely by declaring myself the father. Ellen could dispute her property signature. Ava and Ben could dispute their identities. The lender could freeze its own funds. Investigators could collect proof. My role was to bring the people I loved to the right doors and keep them from being pushed apart before those doors opened. By afternoon, the lender confirmed 3 facts. The application requested $640,000. Cedar Row Renovations was the borrower. Ava and Ben were listed as personal guarantors, and Ellen's orchard was offered as collateral. The twins also placed fraud alerts on their credit files. Ava discovered a new commercial inquiry that had lowered her score days before she was due to apply for a mortgage. Ben found a lender verification call he had dismissed as spam. The fraud had not taken their homes, but it had already entered their ordinary plans. Ava postponed her mortgage appointment. Ben changed the direct deposit account for his small repair business and spent an afternoon proving to vendors that he had not opened Cedar Row. Vanessa called those inconveniences paperwork. To my children, they were hours of their lives spent proving they were themselves. The lender would not yet say who uploaded the documents or where the preliminary draw had gone. Its fraud unit needed to compare the old identity data, current signatures, and the account trail. We had answered the first question. The packet was real. We still did not know whether Vanessa had built it or someone had built it around her. That uncertainty ended for Ava before it ended for me. Vanessa called her that evening. Ava did not secretly record the call. She put it on speaker after Vanessa announced that the lender would require a family correction statement. Ben and Ellen were already in the room, and Ava told Vanessa we could hear. Vanessa hung up. 10 minutes later, she sent a voice message. "Sign the ratification I sent you," she said. "Date it the day on the form. Blood family should not have to beg 2 people Ellen brought home for permission to use our own orchard. If you let Daniel turn this into a police matter, every private thing in that sealed adoption box becomes public. Ask your so-called father whether he can put that back once people see it." Ava listened once. Then she forwarded the message to the lender fraud officer and the investigator. Her hands shook afterward. "She is threatening to tell me who my birth mother is like it is dirt." "She is threatening to take your choice," I said. "Those are not the same thing." Ben wanted to drive to Vanessa's house. Ellen stood in front of the door. "If you love your sister," she told him, "do not make her spend tonight wondering whether you will be arrested too." He gave her his keys. Vanessa's message became her countermove. It showed pressure and knowledge of the file, but it still did not prove she had forged the loan. The next morning, her boyfriend contacted the lender as Cedar Row's operations manager. He demanded that the hold be removed and moved the identity verification meeting forward by 2 days. The lender agreed to meet, but not to release money. The fraud officer invited the borrower, its operations manager, the guarantors, and the property owner. Daniel, the adoptive father, was not necessary to the account, Vanessa said in an email. Ellen read that line twice. "She is still trying to remove you from the room." "The signatures can speak without me," I said. "I do not want to do this without you." That was the first permission that mattered. Ava and Ben gave the second. The fraud officer allowed me to attend as family support and as the person who had received the verification letter. The investigator would attend in his licensed role to preserve the real business interaction. The office disclosed at check-in that commercial verification meetings were recorded. The investigator could document the same authorized interaction and voluntary conduct in the public exterior area. Never a private consultation. Before we went, the lender requested limited comparison copies from the adoption file. Ellen did not want to release them. "Vanessa has already treated those children's beginning like family property," she said. Then we release only what proves the signatures, I replied. Ava and Ben decide. They authorized redacted identity pages from the adoption file to verify legal names, birth dates, and certification history. Their current signature samples went separately through counsel from recent mortgage, employment, and business records. Birth names and private letters remained covered, signing that authorization cost us something. It meant allowing strangers to examine a family record we had protected for nearly 3 decades. It also closed Vanessa's easiest escape. She could no longer claim the signatures were authentic simply because the source pages were private. At the lender's office, Vanessa wore a cream jacket and carried a leather portfolio. Her boyfriend carried nothing. She looked at my cheek before she looked at my eyes. The mark had faded. Her contempt had not. "You should not be here," she said. "Ellen asked me to come. This is blood family property." Ava stepped between us. "Then stop using my name on it." The fraud officer brought everyone into a glass conference room. She did not accuse anyone. She placed the disputed pages on the table and asked each person to identify what they had signed. Ellen pointed to the collateral page. "That is my name. It is not my signature." Ava and Ben said the same about the guarantees. Vanessa opened her portfolio. They agreed verbally. Daniel frightened them after the papers were submitted. "When did they agree?" the officer asked. "At Ellen's house." "Who witnessed it?" Vanessa looked at her boyfriend. "I did," he said. The officer turned to the deed acknowledgement. "And you notarized Ellen's signature?" "She signed in front of me." Ellen's voice became quiet. "You have never been alone with me in my home." He looked down at the page. Vanessa spoke over him. "Ellen forgets things when Daniel pressures her." I felt Ellen's hand tighten around mine. The lie was no longer only about adoption. Vanessa was beginning to build a story in which my wife could not trust her own memory and my children could not trust their own signatures. The fraud officer asked for the original authorization and the device used to submit it. Vanessa said the originals had been misplaced during an office move. Her boyfriend said a former employee uploaded the file. Cedar Row had no former employee listed in its business records. The meeting ended without the hold being lifted. Vanessa smiled at us in the hallway. "You have embarrassed yourselves for nothing." Then she and her boyfriend walked toward the public side exit instead of the garage elevator. They believed the investigator had remained inside with us to collect copies. He had not followed them into any private place. He simply documented what they chose to say in the open commercial courtyard, an area covered by posted business notice and open to customers throughout the day. Vanessa's boyfriend spoke first. "She never signed the deed. You notarized what I gave you, for $3,000. You said the family had agreed. Keep your voice down. What about the twins?" "The box gave us the names and numbers. The orchard forms gave us the signatures. They were never supposed to see the guarantees. The lender wants current signatures." Vanessa answered, "Then we get the ratification or we lose the other $560. The sound of a delivery truck covered the next exchange. Her boyfriend's voice returned first. "You said this was your share of the orchard." "It is. And the first 80. Vanessa lowered her voice again. The investigator preserved the complete original recording and gave the lender only a verified working copy through its fraud channel. He let me hear the clear first section that afternoon with Ellen and the twins present. We now knew the identity data came from the Cedar box, the adult signatures came from the orchard forms, and the backdated ratification was meant to save the remaining $560,000. The argument also tied Vanessa's boyfriend to a deed Ellen denied signing and to a $3,000 payment. The truck had covered what they said about the preliminary draw. The investigator said the original carried more than the small speaker could reveal, but he would not guess. The fraud officer arranged professional review and kept the file intact. I did not need a louder copy to decide whether to proceed. "Submit it," I said. Ellen closed her eyes. That choice ended the last possibility that we could call the loan a misunderstanding and keep family peace by staying quiet. For 35 years, Ellen had ended every argument with Vanessa by leaving a chair open. Christmas after the orchard dispute, Vanessa still had a plate. When she sold their mother's jewelry without asking, Ellen still answered the phone. She believed a closed door could become a habit that outlived the reason for closing it. This time, the open chair had become access to our children's records and her land. If we submit it, she may never speak to me again, Ellen said. If we do not, she learns your silence is permission. Ellen placed her palm over the faded mark on the Father's Day card. Then submit all of it. Vanessa learned about the investigator before the lender finished reviewing the audio. She went to the police and filed a report saying I had stolen the adoption papers, created the loan package, and planted an investigator to frame her. After she rejected my demand for the orchard, she attached a short phone video from the gathering. It began after the slap. In it, I was standing, Ben was at the door, and Vanessa was saying I had no authority over the papers. Without the first 30 seconds, it looked like we were forcing her out because she had questioned me. The accusation was not strong enough to erase the lender's file. It was strong enough to make me a competing suspect. A financial crimes detective asked me to come in, voluntarily. I went with counsel. I gave him the yellow envelope, the full gathering video from Ellen's living room system, the twins' denials, the restricted comparison authorization, and the investigator's license information. I did not ask him to arrest Vanessa. I signed a complaint stating only what I knew personally. He asked whether I had ever controlled Ellen's money, threatened Vanessa over the orchard, or discouraged the twins from contacting blood relatives. Each question sounded like one of Vanessa's sentences, wearing an official coat. I answered anyway. Being innocent did not make the interview painless. For 2 hours, I sat beneath a white light while a detective tested whether my family life was the cover Vanessa described. I understood why he had to ask. I also understood the cost of her false report. She had taken the word father, which I had spent 27 years living quietly, and turned it into a motive police had to examine. When I came home, Ben asked whether they believed me. They are checking me, I said. That was not my question. It is the only honest answer I have tonight. The detective told me the lender would hold a final internal fraud meeting after authenticating the application history and recording. Its purpose was narrow: close or restore the credit line, accept or reject the orchard collateral, and give Cedar Row a chance to respond through counsel before the lender completed its referral. The police did not need to sit in that room. The lender would send the final record afterward. The fraud officer asked whether Ellen, Ava, and Ben wanted the complete audio played in their presence. I told my family the choice belonged to them. All three agreed. Then I want the complete file used, I said. No edited clip. Ava came, Ben came. Ellen came because the orchard bore her name, and the woman accused was her sister. The lender meeting occurred 4 days later. Vanessa and her boyfriend sat with separate attorneys. The fraud officer sat at the end of the table, and the licensed investigator attended only to authenticate the exterior file. The fraud officer began with facts everyone could see. The guarantees carried Ava's and Ben's names. The collateral page carried Ellen's name. All three denied signing. The application belonged to Vanessa's company. An $80,000 preliminary draw had gone out before collateral review. The remaining $560,000 had never left the lender. Vanessa's attorney said a family disagreement did not prove intent. I agree, I said. Everyone looked at me. That is why we agreed to the complete exterior recording, I said. The investigator confirmed that it preserved voluntary conduct in the public commercial Courtyard after the real lender meeting. It contained no private consultation and no invented transaction. The fraud officer asked once more whether any of the three named victims objected to full playback. Ellen said no. Ava and Ben did the same. The fraud officer pressed play. Vanessa's voice filled the conference room. She never signed the deed. You notarized what I gave you. For $3,000. You said the family had agreed. Keep your voice down. The fraud officer wrote down the amount. The recording moved to the twins. The box gave us the names and numbers. The orchard forms gave us the signatures. They were never supposed to see the guarantees. Ben's jaw tightened. The lender wants current signatures. Then we get the ratification, or we lose the other $560. Ellen made a sound I had never heard from her before, not a sob. The breath of a sister, realizing that an old grievance had become a planned theft. The recording reached the delivery truck. Under the engine noise, the professionally reviewed track carried the part we had not heard at home. Her boyfriend said, "You said this was your share of the orchard." "It is, and the first 80. Already split. Move yours before they lock it." What do I tell them about the upload? Use the old office laptop story. They cannot prove which one of us sent it. And Daniel, I already gave police another suspect. Ben half rose from his chair. I did not touch him. I placed the yellow envelope in front of him, the same envelope that had started the investigation. He looked at the forged guarantee carrying his name. Then he looked at the fraud officer and the attorney beside Vanessa. Slowly, he sat back down. Vanessa would not be allowed to replace the recording with one angry moment from him. Ellen removed her sister's old key from her key ring. Vanessa had returned the physical key months earlier, but Ellen still carried its twin out of habit. She set it beside the recording controls. "You did not lose the orchard when our parents died," she said. "You lost the right to call theft an inheritance." Vanessa's attorney told her not to respond. That was the new admission none of us had heard in the smaller working copy. The first drawer was split. Vanessa expected the lender to freeze it, and her police report named me to divert suspicion. The fraud officer stopped writing. The lender had traced the initial $80,000 to 2 accounts controlled by Vanessa and her boyfriend. $3,000 had moved from Vanessa's account to him the day after the false notarization. The application upload came through Cedar Row's business account, and the copied guarantor signatures carried the same distinctive marks as the scanned orchard forms. The recording did not stand alone. The money answered it. The fraud officer spoke first. The remaining $560,000 is permanently blocked from disbursement. The credit line is closed for fraud. We are issuing recovery, holds on funds still traceable from the initial draw, and filing the required referral with law enforcement. She gave Ellen a written confirmation that the lender rejected the orchard collateral and would support removal of any fraudulent title filing connected to its application. Vanessa stood. "This is still a family property dispute." Ellen rose too. "It stopped being that when you copied my children's names." Her voice did not shake. The meeting ended there. That afternoon, the lender completed its referral. After receiving the authenticated file and supporting records, the detective accepted formal complaints from Ellen, Ava, and Ben. I signed as the witness who had received the verification letter and initiated preservation. Investigators verified the voices, accounts, upload history, and notarization payment. A judge reviewed the evidence and signed search and arrest warrants. The following morning, officers arrested Vanessa and her boyfriend at the Cedar Row office. Computers, business records, and remaining funds were seized under the warrants. The arrests did not end the case. Within several weeks, prosecutors filed charges involving identity theft, forgery, attempted theft, the initial transfer, and the false report. Both defendants pleaded not guilty. A separate civil order protected the orchard title, while the forged filings were removed. The lender recovered part of the initial draw. The rest remained part of the criminal and restitution process. No one lost the orchard. Ava and Ben did not inherit a debt they had never approved. Those were the victories that mattered before anyone discussed punishment. The practical repairs took longer than the dramatic ones. Ava's mortgage application stayed paused until the false guarantee disappeared from review. Ben called suppliers one by one and explained that Cedar Row was not his company. Ellen met the title officer with the original orchard deed and signed nothing until her own attorney had read it. I sat beside each of them, but I did not speak in their place. For years, people had described adoption as something Ellen and I did for 2 children. That month reminded me that fatherhood also meant knowing when children who had grown into adults needed their own names, their own signatures, and their own voices returned to them. The lender sent written confirmation when the guarantees were removed. Ava read hers twice, folded it, and put it away without celebration. "I thought I would feel like we won," she said. "Safety often feels quieter than victory." She nodded. Then she reopened her mortgage calendar. The harder consequence happened at our kitchen table. Ellen placed the Cedar record box in front of herself. She had changed the cabinet lock. Vanessa's key no longer worked. "I keep thinking about the hearing when you adopted them," she said. "She cried harder than I did. Maybe she meant it then." "Does that make this worse?" "It makes it sadder." Ellen wrote Vanessa a short letter through counsel. She did not debate the orchard or ask for an apology. She said there would be no direct contact while the cases continued, and no future access to family records or property. Any discussion of Ava's and Ben's birth history would happen only with their permission. Love for a sister did not require leaving the cabinet unlocked. Ben apologized to me for wanting to drive to Vanessa's house. I thought protecting Ava meant making Aunt Vanessa afraid of me. "Protecting someone usually means making the next safe choice easier," I said. He looked toward the workshop. "Even when it is slower, especially then." Ava waited longer before speaking about the recording. When she said we were not twins to her, I felt 5 years old again, like somebody could still decide whether we belonged. I did not tell her belonging was guaranteed by a decree. Vanessa had just proved that paper could be abused. I opened my wallet and showed her the faint crease where I had carried the old card for years before its paper became too fragile. "The judge gave me authority," I said. "You and Ben gave me the word Dad. Those were never the same gift." She leaned against my shoulder. We did not forgive Vanessa in a final family meeting. There was no quiet apology that restored keys, records, access, or trust. If remorse ever came, it would have to survive truth, court, repair, and boundaries. Until then, distance was not revenge. It was the space in which our family could stop defending its own existence. On the first clear Saturday after the orchard order was entered, Ava and Ben came to my workshop carrying a narrow wooden frame. They had placed the old Father's Day card behind new glass. The tea stain remained. One blue handprint was blurred at the edge. The yellow crayon had faded but had not disappeared. Ben hung it above the workbench where I repaired cabinet doors. Ava adjusted the frame until it sat straight. "We thought it belonged here," she said. Ellen stood in the doorway holding 4 cups of coffee. Beyond her, wind moved through the orchard rows. The trees were still ours, but ownership was not what filled the room. The word Dad sat between 2 small blue handprints, protected by glass, and chosen long before anyone tried to turn adoption into a weakness. My cheek had stopped hurting days earlier. That word had never needed to heal.